Good afternoon and welcome to this SC chat on boundaries and ethical considerations in service coordination. I'm Lorelei Pisha. I'm a member of the Virginia Early Intervention Professional Development Center's team. I'm here with Amy Sheldon and Sarah Michaels from the Loudoun Early Intervention ITC, and they're going to introduce themselves a bit more properly, give you some more background on who they are, and then they're going to dive right into our topic and get some conversation going. All right, Sarah, Amy, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you.
All right. Thank you, Lorelei. I guess we can do it on this page briefly because I don't really like this picture. But I'm Amy Sheldon. I work with Sarah at the Loudoun County Early Intervention Program. And currently I serve as program manager, but I am also a service coordinator. I do have a caseload of service coordination, so I'm still in touch with it. And I was a service coordinator for infant and toddler program, or the Part C part, in both Arizona and Fairfax County.
Yeah.
So it's very familiar to me and something I love and enjoy.
All right, I'm Sarah Michaels. I am currently the licensed clinical social worker and also a service coordinator for Loudoun ITC. I work with Amy. She's actually my boss. I've been with Loudoun for about it'll be 8 years this summer. I started really heavy on the service coordination side, and then it kind of transitioned into more of that provider role, but I still do quite a bit of service coordination as well. All right. Do you want me to take this one, Amy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So we would love if you guys can use the stamp tool and just let us know how long you've been a service coordinator. You can feel free to chime into the chat as well. Let us know what system you're from. That would be great.
I think, do we need an explanation on how to use that stamp tool too?
Yes, absolutely. So if you go to your shared screen, at the top there is a button next to your viewing Sarah Michaels screen called View Options. It's a drop down. If you click that and then you hit Annotate, it should bring up a menu of annotations. The fourth button on that menu is a check mark. If you click that, then you can stamp wherever you prefer and even change your stamp. And after you're done stamping, you can click the red X to close out of your annotation menu.
Oh, wow. Looks like we have a decent range. Actually, it looks heavy on both sides, newer and more seasoned. Actually, I see in the chat too, I didn't realize we had out-of-state visitors too. So in case we didn't mention, Loudoun isn't in Virginia. But welcome to the different states. Oh, nice.
Oh, all right.
Lovely. Hopefully, this will be a good discussion, and we want to welcome throughout. I mean, in the beginning, we're going to set up just to give us context, a little more information about the boundaries and ethics. But I mean, embedded within it, if this sparks something within you and you want to share information, we really want to encourage that chat piece of it, where it's just a continual dialogue. And so we're going to try to go ahead and monitor the chat. If there's spaces where we can talk more freely, if you want to unmute, whatever you're comfortable with, we are good with.
Oh. And I think too, this is a dialogue. Please feel free to share. There's not right or wrong answers. We really just sort of hearing everyone's thought process, the way they think about these things, is the idea is just to help everyone else here and learn from each other. So, all right. Let's see. Okay, so we just wanted to start talking about a little bit of the difference with professional boundaries and ethics and kind of how they tie together. So when we look at professional boundaries, we're talking about a defined limit within a relationship. Professional boundaries are important for a couple of reasons, but really it helps to clarify everyone's role and expectations. And it protects us and the people that we work with. So they kind of serve a number of functions, not just professionally, but also personally. And it can help us with abiding by professional standards and preserving our physical and emotional energies as well. When we look at professional boundaries, we're kind of looking at they're broader, they're less clear cut than ethical principles. And ethical principles are more of a way to describe what professionals must do or must not do and are consistent across programs. And professional boundaries is typically more of the space between a professional's power and the client's vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And then sometimes using those ethics to help inform our boundaries too. And also just that idea, I mean, back to that quote we used to advertise that sometimes when it comes to ethical decisions, what's difficult is that there are sometimes no clear-cut answers. It really is only decisions. And we want to kind of explore that space a little bit more and to tease out when we have to make those decisions, you know, what do we look at? And that kind of helps. We want to face some of those implicit biases too, which I think in the handout, you have some of those reflection questions to kind of bring awareness to different things of how we're making our decisions. Because I don't know if we're always conscious of why we're saying what we're saying or what we're sticking to. So we just kind of want to have this space to explore all of that. You know what, when I change the slides, it goes much slower.
All right. So professional code of ethics. A code of ethics is a guide of principles to help professionals conduct business with honesty and integrity. So something that's a little bit unique to service coordination is that we're all coming from a variety of different backgrounds. So a service coordinator, you know, depending on what your background is, you may have learned different code of ethics, or you may have different boundaries and ethics that you apply to your work. So looking at that, some of these backgrounds we come from may also not have a set code of ethics, or it may be really broad. So some of the code of ethics that we are familiar with are the social work code of ethics, the counseling code of ethics, the code of medical ethics. There's also like ethics for accounting, ethics for educators as well. So kind of as we go through this, and you can throw it in the chat too if you wanted, how much of your discipline's code of ethics was discussed while you were going through your program. I know for me, going through social work school, we spent a lot of time on the code of ethics and many hours discussing it and sort of applying it. I think Amy's program was even a bit more rigorous.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, because we both came from social work programs, but for us, we had to have a whole course on it, like a semester-long course just on the code of ethics. And what I started noticing working in different systems, like when I was at the hospital or at schools, you start noticing some of the differences even. But yeah, I mean, in your disciplines, did you have a lot of time studying your specific professions code? And you can just throw quick comments in the chat, just out of curiosity. Full course on ethics too. Oh yeah, with human services. Yeah, and I think that's what Sarah was saying too, going back to in service coordination, we're coming from a variety of disciplines. I mean, even for our hybrid providers too, we have those who are PTs and service coordinators or SLPs and that kind of thing. So nice. Thank you.
So thank you guys.
And then I'm sorry, I am advancing this slide, but it is.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, can you go to the next one?
Yep.
Oh, it looks like a lot of human services ones here too. So these are just reflection questions just to have as a framework. And again, this is part of the handout too. In the handout, you're going to see, this came from one of the social work models. And so you'll see the words saying, you know, another social worker or client or that kind of thing. Here we're plugging in service coordinator, placing the family first. And again, just kind of one set to kind of guide us in some of the questions when we are a little more stuck or looking for a more definitive decision. But there are so many different models out there. I just like these because they're a little more clear cut and can apply to a lot of different scenarios. And also with some of the reflection questions, you don't have to hit every one. If even the first couple or some, in the middle really help you tease out that decision-making process for you, all the better. But we wanted to kind of at least ground with something to start with.
Yeah, and these are great questions to discuss with a peer or with a supervisor as you're sort of walking through some of these questions or decisions rather that you are making.
And Sarah, I think you might just have to do the, mine, it's like taking 30 seconds in between.
Okay, I'll just plan to do it. And if I forget, just tell me and I'll just give you a reminder. So this piece, we're sort of moving into the more specifics of service coordination, and this is from the knowledge and skills for service coordinators. And it basically talks about the different things that are required of service coordinators, but professionalism was the one that we thought fit best here, and was sort of most similar to looking at ethics and boundaries, but set personal and professional boundaries and use leadership skills, applying ethical practices, policies, and procedures in relationships and interactions. So again, that's very broad, and we're coming to this from different disciplines, but this felt the most relatable to us for ethics and boundaries within service coordination. I think everyone here knows how vast and broad service coordination is. So the question of ethics and boundaries is definitely a much more of a gray area. I don't think there are a lot of black and white situations that we come across. So one of the other things that we think sort of to consider and something that again is unique to the profession is that we are also in people's homes, and oftentimes we are seeing them very frequently than we would in an outpatient clinic or even like a K through 12 school system. So there is a level of intimacy and just sort of getting to know families that makes it different than other roles as well. And I think that also factors into how we sort of view these decisions that we have to make. So these are a few definitions and expectations we found of service coordinators. The first is a joint statement from the Division of Early Childhood and IDEA about what service coordination does. And then further, DEC further defines the expertise recommendation. And then we also just pulled from the Virginia ITC partnerships packet what their sort of expectation and view of service coordination was. So I think here, if you guys want to read through those and just sort of think about these definitions a little bit as we move through this, because there's some things that are very specific within these definitions and also some things that are very broad within these definitions. So, when it talks about community resources, what exactly are we looking at, and where does our responsibility to helping connect families with community resources begin and end? Are there other parts of the duties that we have that take precedence over certain other things? So definitely think about that as we work through the scenarios today and have these conversations.
And actually, to start with too, on the next slide, there's a couple questions, and just out of curiosity. So the reason that Sarah and I wanted to present on this topic in particular is because we have been kind of grappling, even within our own system, of where that line is sometimes and what is our role and what isn't. And so when we were saying, well, what exactly is that role? I mean, I know when we go through our certification, we're learning about the service coordination role and the process and that kind of thing. And sometimes, Sarah, can you skip to the next one?
Yep.
When we see, I think sometimes what it turns into is it's a little bit more of this case management side, and does it get murky there? We're going to talk about crisis management and how the service coordination role kind of sometimes gets consumed in that too. But just as a general soft chat to start us off, what are some of the expectations that you've gleaned in your systems, in your local system, of what you believe the service coordination role is, or what the emphasis has been in your role. And you're welcome to unmute or throw it in the chat, and just to kind of get us started in the context of how we define the role across the board. And because even within the state, I think it's going to be different system to system. And I think it also makes a difference sometimes with who your manager is, and who's guiding the work.
I know for me, I definitely very much first and foremost view the service coordinator as the team leader. So the person that really is facilitating all of the steps in early intervention process, and that community resource piece and connecting families kind of comes secondary for me. And within that role as the team leader is just sort of that advocate and really first point of contact for the family. And so I think even within system person to person, we have differences too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Navigate the family, being the face of our local ITC. Yep.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, this is how I had associated the role too. And I think before we get too into it, we're going to have different scenarios where I feel like sometimes is it better to have that set standard where we remember what that position or the role is? Or, you know, is there a lot of latitude in that gray area, like Sarah was saying, with what does it mean to connect services? Because on the one hand, you know, yes, it's important to connect services or resources to families, because to do that will help them to access early intervention services. But on the other, does it get to be a slippery slope where we then become more like support coordination or crisis intervention? All right. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yes, and now it's being slow for me.
Okay.
Hold on. All right, so we kind of wanted to cover 3 different topics where there might be boundary or ethics challenges. We're looking at crisis support, self-determination, and dual relationships. I don't know if anyone wants to use their stamp again, and Seth, if we need more instruction, maybe you can come on and tell us again, but what type of boundary or ethics do you feel like issues do you feel like are most challenging for you? Just so we can get a feel for where everybody's at.
Yeah, quick reminder, if you go to view options over the shared screen, annotate, and then the 4th button down on that menu that pops up, that gives you the stamp tool. And feel free to comment as well.
So far, it looks like a lot of crisis support. Some, yeah, and now it's going to dual relationships.
We're spread kind of across.
And it's a big X on crisis support. I think, but you know what? That is, again, what brought us to this topic, just some of these musings too. And everything we talk about in these slides and these scenarios have actually happened even within the last year. And so they're experiences we've had and had to navigate ourselves. So awesome.
All right, and I'm seeing a lot in the chat of a lot of crisis support as well, a couple dual relationships, so great. And I think Jess Tellstrom, you have your hand up. Do you mean to have your hand up or no?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay,
I'm
awesome.
the one who put the giant X on crisis support. I work, I'm a service coordinator for the deaf and hard of hearing and east side of Indy, and I am very much a feeler, an empath, if you will. And so I struggle greatly with living in my community and also serving my community. And, you know, not everybody always needs a lot of support here on the east side. And so I really struggle with being on top of all the pantries that are open or that have closed. And I definitely get sucked into the crisis support.
Yeah.
So that's my big X.
Well, and I think that's an easy one to get sucked into because sometimes we feel that sense of urgency with that crisis too, and a lot of times we are the only sometimes resource that a family is connected to. And I think it's hard, we tend to be that hub where we have information for different research, like, we know where to refer for housing or for food or, that kind of thing. Where for a family, it can be hard to navigate if you're not familiar with the system too. And so I think that's definitely a big urgent one. And actually, that's our first slide.
Yeah, that's a good leeway right into this.
And it looks like a big X on CPS. But so with CPS, what we have encountered actually several times, most recently, is sometimes too, because that SC is that hub of communication and that team lead and that source of support, sometimes providers or contractors are reaching out if they have concerning situations and they're touching base with the SC saying, I think we might need to establish safety, or I think we need to call CPS possibly. And I think it puts the SC in that difficult position. And we'll talk later too about how it's really everybody's role. But I think sometimes this is where it gets murky, where we have that leaning toward crisis support. And is that really what our program is? And again, that question is sometimes we need to help mitigate the crisis, yes, to be able to access services, but where does that line start and stop? And then like the financial emergencies and the housing crisis, they're related. It's very difficult when you are in a situation where you are in the family's home and they are in front of you and they are pleading with you saying, I don't know where I'm going to live next week. I want a safe place for my kids and I'm really scared about this. What can I do? Or, we've even had a situation where a family saying, I can't get to WIC, I can't access other services, and I'm going to run out of formula today, and I need to feed my child. And then this is where using your own resources comes in. Do you make that call where you are just saying, okay, I'm gonna just pay for it this time? Or, if they're out of diapers or that kind of thing. And so these are all the situations that we can encounter amongst many more. But, Jess, you were talking about your situation with the finances, or I'm sorry, with some of those urgent needs for resources. Are there any others that you guys can think of that have come up recently for you or that have been pretty prevalent for you?
And feel free to put it in the chat or unmute, raise the virtual hand.
And then can you skip to the next slide, Sarah?
Yep.
And so even with this too, Sarah and I, so there is a context, I think they call it, and I always get this wrong, it's not unilateral, it's relativism, and what's the other word, Sarah, do you remember?
Absolutism.
Absolute, yes. Where, sometimes where the ethical dilemma comes in with this is, can you do for one what you can do for all? And so that's where I tend to lean, where I'm like, I'm just going to blanketly say, I'm not going to do this, or I am going to do this for everybody. Whereas the relativism is really more about, it depends. It's just like relationships are unique in our own personal lives. These relationships can be different too. So, where does that fall? Jessica, you were saying caregiver mental health crises have come up here. Connecting parents who have developmental delays. Oh, yes. Yeah. And I think that too, for Teresa, what she was saying with the case management housekeeping, if a parent themselves might have a developmental delay, is also that sense of need for extra support to make sure they're connecting too.
Yeah.
But I think this is sometimes where we talk about not just the ethics, but then the boundaries. Is this an area where if we're able to institute boundaries, would that prevent us from getting into some ethical situations as well?
Yeah. Does Jessica or Teresa or Angela, anyone want to unmute and maybe talk about what you did in one of those situations and how you kind of came
Mhm.
to that conclusion?
I can definitely. It's funny that you used the houseless situation, because just this morning I had a mother who I'm her only support, and dad, apparently is going back to jail, and mom was evicted on last Monday, and she's just like, I have no one to talk to. Can you help me? And here I was, like, spending, I don't know, like 30-40 minutes contacting this person and this person to get these resources, and I'm like, I can't do this. Like, I cannot do this. We got to figure it out. We got her help, but it's just like, it's hard to not get that sucked in, and to not get sucked in. And our agency, at least, they don't, when you start this role, they don't really go over the things um that you shouldn't really do. They'll like, hey, heads up, this is going to be a little difficult, or you're probably going to see a lot of this. And it's also hard because we have like one social worker for our whole entire, like, east side, and probably more. And so I also, that guilt in not overworking somebody who's already severely overworked, when I can easily just look up something. But when I have 60, 70 kids that I end up doing that for, then I get severely behind.
Yeah. And I think that knowing where that responsibility begins and ends, right? Of what's mine to take on versus what's mine to leave on the table, or, can I refer them to someone else? And,
Mhm.
there are people within at least our counties here that have that is their job to dig and find more of these resources, but that's not necessarily always available.
Yeah,
But I think what you're saying kind of ties into a couple people in the comments talking about bilingual families or families that do not speak English and needing
absolutely.
more help to access those services. And that, I think, is just a complication, or it farther complicates things, rather, because you feel like they are even more helpless. And we as professionals know how hard it can be to access the resources sometimes. But I don't know if anyone has a specific example of what they've done when it has been a family that does not speak English, or how they've supported that family, and sort of where they decided that boundary was for them.
Yeah, and I mean, just to jump into that a little more too, I think that's where, sometimes when we're talking, sometimes we talk interchangeably about ethics and boundaries, and then sometimes this is where I think this is where boundaries helps to mitigate some of those ethical decisions as well. Because I think, we do kind of slide into that crisis role a lot, and we are not always equipped for that. And I think it's okay. I mean, that's even when so when we're looking at some of the decision-making models or the reflection questions, when we're talking about sustainability too, how can we help support this family to continue it on their own as well? And in crisis, I think it's different because it feels so immediate. But at the same time, too, in the beginning, I think what you were saying, just it comes back to volume. And sometimes it's difficult to be able to sustain that for everybody. And then it goes back to, should you go back to a more what we do for one, we should do for all, or, all for one? And, do we establish those boundaries in the beginning by saying, these are our office hours. Should you have a crisis, here's a list of resources you can contact after hours when we're gone. When I was in school social work, we used to have to always put it in our signature block, different emergency resources, so that families always had access to it if they were just doing a search for our name. And so it's like, I think the other part is, in one of the reflection questions, am I placing the client first, or am I motivated by my own needs? And I think sometimes it's really difficult to tell. Sometimes what is personal might really be professional, and again, vice versa. Because is it a personal thing where I feel like I have to help, and I have to mitigate this need for anxiousness and urgency, or is it a situation where it would be more helpful to place the family with different resources too? So it's so many things that have come up. And yeah, Tina, you're saying when children have been removed, the provider requesting that I, as the SC, tell the family what to do. Yeah. You know, the SC has so many roles. We are CPS, we are, the coordinated services, counselors. I think that gets really difficult. And I think this also shows some discomfort in these situations where, as different disciplines or even backgrounds, we're not always prepared to be able to respond. And so we think the best thing is to connect to somebody who can do that. And so I think it's difficult to try to establish those boundaries, not just with the family, but with the providers too.
That sort of is also making me wonder, does anyone's agency or local system have specific guidelines that you can refer to or kind of fall back on in these situations? Again, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat, because I think those can really help guide us in these situations, but they don't always exist, because I don't know that it's everyone's natural inclination to think, okay, this is another part of the job we're going to have to be doing.
I think sometimes it doesn't help too if that is the expectation of the agency or the manager.
Right.
It's difficult to push back against that.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Amy, you said you have a packet pre-made with resources.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think it's important to have that available from the beginning too, to help establish those boundaries.
Absolutely. I think one thing in Loudoun,
Providers, yeah.
Yeah. We are pretty much always going to bring a supervisor in if there's a CPS question or wondering, and for other additional resources. And I found that really helpful for myself, because it gives you that reinforcement that your train of thought or your, decision is okay and sound, and also just gives you that opportunity to bounce your ideas off of somebody and talk it out.
And I think, I'm not sure if it's on one of these models that we provided, but another question are, what are the consequences down the line? So we can make this decision now, but then what happens later based on this decision? Are we getting into this enabling relationship, or is it, we understand that the family can handle, they themselves have been good at establishing boundaries, so they understand this is a one-time thing, or that kind of thing. I think sometimes we forget about the down the line when the urgency is so immediate.
I also think, as we were putting this together, I shared a situation years ago that I was in, and Amy's immediate response was exactly the opposite of what I did. And so there really isn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer for these things. You have to make the best decision you can in the moment with the information that you have. And that's why I think those reflection questions that Amy keeps referring to are really so important, because am I doing this for the right reasons? And is this, being able to sit with your own discomfort if you decide not to do something, or being able to say, you know what, my reason for doing this is really sound. And I think the relationship I have with this family and the boundaries I've established can lend this to being an ethical decision, to being an okay thing to do right now.
Mm-hmm. And as Amy Lewis was saying too, starting from the very beginning and talking about your boundaries, I think is important. That intake conversation, providing those resources in the beginning. Yeah. Oh, okay. Mariela too, saying the same. Yeah, I do think it's important in the beginning. Should we go to self-determination?
Yeah. All right, it's finicky for me too, so there we go. So self-determination, I kind of pulled the social work definition because that's just what's most familiar to me. But we want to, and I think it's actually applicable to service coordination as well, but we want to enhance a client's capacity and opportunity to change and address their own needs. And also looking at it as the importance of each individual being ideally qualified to make decisions concerning his or her life. So looking at situations where a family's priorities may be different than ours in terms of goals, types of services desired, frequency of service, or a family's right to not continue communication or services. Sometimes it's going to be, they're going to make decisions that we don't think are the right decision or that we wouldn't make. And being able to honor that and respect that, so long as it's not harmful to themselves or to others. And the definition of harmful even can get a little bit tricky. And like, I think that's where it's really important to talk it out. But I think in our role as service coordinators with this self-determination piece, I think we're in a unique position to really be an advocate for the family, like within the context of the IFSP, and those IFSP's reviews, in terms of advocating for the goals that they want with providers, those frequency needs, and really, I think sometimes even giving parents permission to go with their gut and make the decisions that feel right for them, even if it's different than what the team may be recommending.
I think something that's come up a lot with us recently in our program with self-determination has been those, when is it okay to close a family? And so I think sometimes, we have the typical standard of if we make 3 attempts and then if we don't hear from them, we, send a letter and we close in 10 days or, whatever the situation is. But then there's always those that, might have a difficult situation. So we are hesitant to close them because we don't want to let go. They've been going through so much. Or, one recent example is we felt like a family's choice to not communicate after they have been so involved was a purposeful choice. And so we thought it would be appropriate to go through the motions and close, because, if you consider the context of, all different types of communication, no communication is communication. But then, even in our own program, we had differing opinions because they were so involved as well. CPS was involved in a different context, not with where the child was residing. There was some hesitancy to close there too, and wanting to do extra efforts and steps. And so, at what point is it the family's choice to be able to proceed this way versus how involved should we be? And I think even with the next slide, do you guys have any situations where you've dealt with self-determination just as a crossroads? And have you had differing opinions, just like, how we described too, from your system or peers or that kind of thing? I mean, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, feel free to unmute too, or raise your hand, or put it in the chat.
Mm-hmm. So Ashley saying, I always express to families to also talk to providers for another set of eyes about it if there are other concerns to consider before exiting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like this because again, this is a team decision. Like you shouldn't have to feel the pressure of making these decisions in a vacuum either. Also, we've had the flip side where we also kept the family open a little longer, even though they were situated, because we just wanted to have that, little extra transition time for them because they've been through so many circumstances, like a death of a father and, that kind of thing. But then I think, this is what Sarah and I were debating back and forth. And this, Jennifer, you were saying it's a case-by-case basis. Yeah, it's just, how can we justify it? What were the reasonings in place to be able to say, yes, we would open it here so that we can, have that understanding of this is why we made that decision versus because it just felt right.
Yeah. I like, Christina, you said that you remind families that they can always re-refer. And I think that's a great way to support a family's self-determination if they feel like they're ready to close, really stressing that they It's not going to impact their ability to come back, or, they're not going to be denied services in the future. And Susie, I think too, hearing that it's okay to say no or not now, I call that sort of like you're giving the family permission to say no, and they don't actually need your permission, but sometimes I think it's really empowering for them to hear that from you, the professional, it's okay to say no, or more is not better, or if this is stressful for you, we don't have to do this right now. So I think all of these are really awesome, awesome ways for supporting that self-determination piece.
Because I think it's also a reminder, this is not just about our boundaries, it's also about advocating for families to set boundaries as well, and that that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, again, going back to different disciplines, some of us thought, we made the attempts, at least in writing and phone and that kind of thing, and that's good enough. Whereas others wanted to do like a drop by to see, if they could catch the family. And some thought, is that too invasive? And the other thought, oh no, I'm showing care. So again, the same program, different disciplines, but not even different disciplines all the time. Sarah even just explained how she and I were on opposite ends of a spectrum for a decision, and we're both social workers. So
yeah. I think, Cassie, you said it's easier for me to discharge as service coordinator knowing that there are other agencies involved and they are still supported and monitored. I definitely think that gives me a lot of comfort too. It makes me feel good that there's still some continuation of care. I also think this is where it kind of comes in a little bit too. It links back to crisis support, is we don't want to do it all for them. We want to give them the tools to do it themselves, and empowering them with those tools hopefully can also help us feel good of, okay, I supported them, I didn't do it for them, and hopefully they'll be able to carry that with them even after they're closed out.
and not to throw a wrench in things, but going back to, is this about me feeling good about it? Or is this about what we do? Or this is for the family? I think that's the thing that we do have to temper a lot.
Absolutely.
And then just for the sake of time, should we jump into
Up to the
And so with this, now onto that topic of dual relationships, I think this is something we come across just as frequently, I think, as crisis too, that gets to be murky. And so this is where that relativism sometimes comes in. And what is that other word again? I keep forgetting.
absolutism.
Yes, this is where I feel like I'm a little more absolute. But dual relationships, just even that giving of gifts or do you accept the birthday party invitation? Do you do closing gifts, or do you accept the gifts they give you? Separate business arrangements or sibling fundraisers, simple as, do you buy the Girl Scout cookies from the older sibling, or if they're having some kind of fundraising thing, or oddly enough, sometimes that separate business arrangement came in. Sarah recently just experienced this with a family asking about her interest in joining a podcast that they had, or even with they had some extra abilities that maybe are for entertainment value that seem intriguing, but still to participate would be potentially boundary crossing. Receiving calls after hours for additional help. This is actually something that I ran into more when I was doing preschool mental health at the schools. So sometimes, the early childhood special educators that are resource-based, they are very similar to the providers. They'll go into the homes as well, or the daycares. And so they have that frequency of relationship with a parent. They're in that intimacy of that home setting. And so sometimes this is not just after hours if we have an emergency. Sometimes it's Sunday afternoon and it's a phone call because, my son had an absolute meltdown and I'm about to lose it. And you have to help me, talk me through this. What am I supposed to do? And so it's, again, that emergency feeling or the urgency for the family and reaching out after hours. Or, even Sarah in her social worker role has similar things where it's emails about, we had a terrible night of sleep trying all these, efforts and everything you recommended, and we're still not getting it. And it's just, I feel like that sense of urgency sometimes comes through where you want to be able to respond 8 p.m. Or otherwise. So sometimes getting into those dual relationships.
Yeah.
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 Yes, Jess, what you were saying. It's difficult because sometimes too, if we say technically, hey, I'm a non-exempt employee, so my hours are all over the place. I think, where is it okay to where we say, here's the line, even though our office hours are this, but I might do visit hours later. Does that get confusing, or are we able to establish that in the beginning? And when you're saying part of town you live with, sometimes too, if we're in regions, we're able to be assigned in areas we live close to, running into families, even just, maybe you're both on the same soccer team or dance studio or that kind of thing.
That happens all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, do you ever encounter them where it's difficult for you to navigate, or do you have to have set boundaries or anything like that?
I think it just requires, I'm very honest about, like, with my boss, my team leader, about, that happening. Or, with the schedule thing, like, it's something that works for my schedule best. And honestly, if it makes my families happy and it makes them like first steps even more, then cool, awesome. I'll be that person. But no, I don't find it difficult at all. Sometimes it's a little awkward. Um, when we're out in public, but it's one of those things where I always make sure that I am not the first person to initiate contact.
Yes. Yes.
And even then, it's still like keep it short and sweet, because it doesn't need to be this whole like, I don't know. I don't want it to feel forced or or obligated. But it happens very frequently. My husband and I also own a coffee shop in on the east side, and not it's not rare for people to be like, oh yeah, we know who you are, you own blah blah blah, and I'm like, uh-huh, yeah,
Right.
that's me. I have no idea who you are. This is great. But we normally just laugh. Like, I've never ever had that come back to be weird. I try and just be like, this is what makes it special that I work in, and live in the community. Like, I'm just trying to keep positive, but the flexible hours thing, that makes it rough. You're right.
Yeah. Well, and I think in your situation too, it's hard to avoid that dual contact in different settings as well. And I think part of it is, and I swear, like a minute ago, I tried to advance the slide, so eventually it's going to get there. But I think so sometimes it's to be expected. And so I think it's just like you were saying, establishing those boundaries where you wait for them to approach first. Because, we don't know if they're okay with other people knowing that they're receiving services or whatever. That's what sometimes that recommendation is in private practice counseling settings too. But also, I think in other scenarios when we're getting into friendship things, or what have you, is there a point where we feel like that power differential will shift? And so are they going to be in a position too where they feel like if it's not working for them anymore, are they going to feel okay requesting another service coordinator? Or are they going to feel obligated to agree with you on a certain situation because of your other relationship? And then I saw a question.
Seeing, in the chat, I think we've had a couple of comments come in about just setting up, Christina mentioned letting them know your work hours right off the bat. And I think that's really important. I am very guilty of, I like a response right away from people, so I want to give them a response right away. But I started sort of incorporating that of like, I will get back to you the next business day. And that has seemed to help. And then Jocelyn said, I wish there was a policy established through the county program that allows a person to use the policy as a way to create boundaries, such as with gifts or hours, etc. I agree with you 100%. And sometimes I will even say there's a policy, even if there's not, to back myself up. Or I will say, let me check with my supervisor. Because that is definitely really, really tricky. I think there's also cultural considerations when people are giving you gifts and things like that that you have to consider. And it really is not like a one size fits all thing.
Well, and sometimes there are policies, but they're so buried. It's not always talked about during trainings and such. Because if you're starting in July and it's not a big deal, but then as the holidays come, so sometimes even when I was in private practice, I would reiterate the policy of gifts and that kind of thing. We talk about it at intake, but then there's times where, okay, well, what would you consider a gift? I remember I was working with a 4-year-old who worked with her mom. She knew I liked penguins. And so for one of the sessions came in, and those like iron, like they're beads in a pattern, and then you iron them into place. Like she worked so hard with her mom and making it, and she gave it to me and she was so proud. And so at that point, it's like, I'm not, at that time, I will be transparent. I felt like saying, even though I feel like I'm an absolutist or whatever the term is, saying, you work so hard on this, thank you. This is, so you thought about the penguins and that kind of thing. And so instead I kind of displayed it in the office setting. And maybe that was my way of kind of finding that middle ground too. So I think it's hard, but I think this is where the boundaries come in again. And it's okay to reiterate some of that so that to prevent some of those ethical decisions. The APA suggests considering like for the Facebook requests and that kind of thing, or birthday parties, does it matter how much time has passed? So, we were even talking about relationships, like romantic relationships. Some ethics, like, is it psychology, Sarah? I can't remember, where there's an X amount of years before you can enter into a relationship, whereas social work says you can never enter into a relationship with a client, former client, or that kind of thing.
And I think, I was gonna say, it's an LPC, which is also a counselor, very similar to social work, but I think they have a 2 or 3 year, and then you can like be friends on Facebook or like have a friendship with them. And I think psychologists, it's just 1 year. So you may even see people who are doing very similar work to what you're doing with those different sort of considerations that they
But
make.
although, they also say, think of other questions considered, like how vulnerable was this family when you were working with them? And will that impact your relationship post services? Or, what was the nature of the termination? Or again, will this kind of come into that enabling relationship dynamic? So other things, it might not just be a one-time thing or situation. And again, in the interest of time, I think let's just skip ahead to the next one. Standards can actually,
Want me to bounce back?
no, let's go to clarifying expectations.
Okay.
And then we can always open for questions too.
Yeah.
So some of the things, and the clarifying expectations one is in the handouts as well, or the handout. It's a one-pager. A lot of the things we touched on, but something I do really want to emphasize is I tell this to my team a lot, and I don't want it downplay like or dismissive, but we are not by design a crisis agency. So I think it's okay to operate that way, to kind of provide those crisis resources when appropriate, to encourage or to reiterate the mandated reporting so you don't feel like you as the SC have to carry that decision or the burden on your soldiers. We are all mandated reporters working in this system. We talked about seeing a family in public, or the work hours and the boundaries. What else was there? A couple, or let's see. Angela, you were saying couple children on my caseload have serious. Uh-huh. Well, that's a great question. Let me bring it to everybody. What are your thoughts about this? So Angela's situation, she's saying for some of the medically fragile children that we might work with, and her background being of faith, it seems natural for her to be able to offer support to these parents by offering that they'll pray for their child and for them. And is this crossing boundaries or creating a dual relationship? So as people want to kind of chew on this a little bit and give their thoughts, I also want to provide the perspective of setting too, because I actually ran into this a lot more when I was a pediatric palliative social worker in the hospital, where sometimes that element of faith is already embedded because we have the chaplain there as available. And sometimes when you're in these settings of near death and families are asking you to pray for them too, is it different if a family is saying it versus you are offering that before they've said anything? Does it make a difference if you know their religious culture or not? Marty, you're saying you ask permission. Mm-hmm.
I also wonder too, there's a difference between sort of just making I'll be thinking of you and praying for your family as, that sort of being one thing versus really going down that road or pushing your faith on somebody when you don't know their faith, and those types of things. So I think it's not necessarily clear cut, but also sort of how you present it and where you draw the line of like, okay, I've said this, I don't really know where they're at with these things, but the intention was.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also a piece of service coordination being open to what the culture of the family is or identifying what that culture is. And so whether it's religious, whether it's family makeup or anything, I think that's important. And with Marty, you were saying too, same with birthdays, Christmas, Easter, asking if they celebrate. Because I think, even when I grew up, I mean, I was born in the 70s, so it was a little bit different, but they would have it was always going to be Merry Christmas and you celebrate. It was a Christmas party, not a holiday party, or, that kind of thing. And some assumptions there where it's different. And just like the assumptions of you will have things or turkey on Thanksgiving or, that kind of thing. And so I think that's part of the cultural humility piece that I know we talk about in social work, but that kind of transcends into our work a little bit too, seeing where a family's at and then entering that opening. And is it okay if they've initiated it for you to kind of offer it? Or is it better to kind of wait and see?
Yeah, I think we've got some great suggestions in the chat. Waiting for an opening or asking if they celebrate things like Christmas, Easter, birthdays. Have they shared first? And if it's not clear, asking. And then Katie said, if they've mentioned their faith beforehand, I may use the word pray. Otherwise, I send positive support and thoughts, something along those lines and more neutral. I think those are all great ideas. And I personally have never had an experience where a family has been offended when I've asked what their cultural background is or what their religious beliefs are, because I think when we're doing it, we're coming from a place of, I want to support you in a way that is meaningful to you. And I find families are usually very happy to share.
But with that, any closing questions? Because this is just a 1 hour thing, right, Lorelai? I just want to make sure to respect everybody's time. Any closing thoughts or questions or anything that anyone has?
And why don't we, so quickly, why don't you advance to the next slide and then we could stay on for a few minutes for those who maybe have a question that they want to send your way, but I could go ahead. Just so you all know, here are Sarah and Amy's emails at their work in early intervention in Loudoun County. Again, not their personal email, setting the professional boundary there. And then if you'll mind sending to the next slide, I just wanted to let everybody know for attending today, in order to get your certificate, you're going to want to check your inbox. You'll have a survey there. to complete. And once you complete that survey, you'll be able to download a certificate. I did want you to also note that on the survey, we do ask if there are particular topics that you would like us to chew on next for these SC chats. And then also ask if you have any interest in facilitating one of those sessions as well. And one more thing, I did also want to share a tool called the Eco Map, which can also be really helpful when you're in those early, when you're setting those initial stages, setting those initial boundaries and helping families grow their self-determination, really looking at the Eco Map for what are your supports, what are your informal and formal. I just wanted to share that we have a talks on Tuesday. We have a 2-part series on eco mapping or eco mapping, whichever you stress that word. And I just put that in the chat if anybody wanted to check that out kind of in relation to this conversation, the way that you all were talking about kind of growing that self-determination. But I'm gonna now, if Sarah and Amy want to hold on for a moment to answer questions to those who want to stick around, maybe 5 minutes, and
Sure.
then we can go ahead and send things to email.
Sure.
Yeah, and I want to make sure
Sure.
the folks in the chat are saying that they weren't able to get a link and they just want to make sure that they're able to get the certificate.
So for those who did not, I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. Why don't you go ahead and email me and I will work with our team to make sure that you receive the certificate.
And then there was also a question that when selecting the region, it says NOVA, is that for participants not in Virginia? So NOVA is short for Northern Virginia, but is there an option for participants not in Virginia to check?
All right, why don't you email me with that, Seth? I know you're on here too, but I think it might be easier for us to specifically fix it or clarify it for you by email. I'm writing down some of these email addresses now.
But otherwise, yes, we will be on a few more minutes if you guys have any questions. But if not, I really appreciate everybody's input and participation. And we are open. If you have any questions, please reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask that you all email us because sometimes we might lose an email in the chat. So why don't you go ahead and I'll put mine in again. Instead of putting your email in the chat, ask that you email me just to make sure that I'm able to individually make sure that each of you gets your login or your certificate.
Otherwise, thank you guys.
This was really wonderful, you all. I definitely wrote down some tips here. And I liked a lot of the kind of the models you gave us to think about in the reflection questions. Do we have anybody else sticking around with a question? Jessica, it's okay. Just select whichever is the closest to you and then, or email us and we'll help you complete it.